Hey, I'm Nathan, and I want to start today with something that sounds like a small thing until you sit with it for a second. There are people in this world whose hands know things before their brains catch up. Surgeons, machinists, piano tuners. And the man in this story spent 22 years in a line of work where that gap, that half second between what your fingers understand and what your mind is willing to admit, is the exact distance between a normal Tuesday and a funeral. He cleared land that had been left full of buried death by wars that ended before his daughter was born. He came home to a quiet limestone town in Indiana, married a local girl, opened a small business, measuring how hard the ground shakes when the quarry sets off a shot. Ordinary, boring even. And then one morning he unzipped his 8-year-old school backpack to pack her lunch, and his hands stopped moving before his brain did. What she said next, when he asked her what it was, is the reason I couldn't let this story go. So stick with me, because the way this man answered it is one of the most patient, most surgical, most quietly devastating things I have ever had the privilege of telling you about. Dade Steadman had a saying he never explained to anyone, because explaining it made it sound like poetry, and he had no patience for poetry. The ground keeps its own ledger. He learned it in his second year, in a wet field outside a village in Cambodia, where the rice came up green and beautiful over 4 decades of buried ordnance. He was 23, thin as fence wire, and he had been taught the drill until it lived in his hands rather than his head. Prod at 30 degrees, never straight down, 1 centimeter at a time. If the prod stops for a reason, and the reason is never nothing. The organization he worked for was not an army, though it wore uniforms and had ranks and a chain of command that would have looked familiar to any soldier. It was a paramilitary mine action group, funded by a rotating cast of governments and foundations, and it existed to walk slowly across the worst ground on earth and make it safe enough for a child to run across. That was the whole job. Walk slow, make it safe, write everything down. Dade started on his belly in the mud with a prod and a detector, and he was good at it because he was patient in a way that unnerved his instructors. Other young men got the shakes, or got bored, or got cocky, and the cocky ones were the ones who left in a helicopter. By 28, he was running a clearance team in Bosnia, where the mines were newer and the maps were lies. By 32, he was an explosive ordnance disposal technician, rated for the ugliest categories, working a road in Angola that had been seeded 3 separate times by 3 separate factions who had all used different logic. By 38, he was a technical field manager in northern Iraq, with 4 teams under him, and a task book that ran to 1,100 pages. And in all of it, the thing he came to believe was not about courage, it was about accounting. Every mine had come from a factory. Every factory stamped a lot number. Every crate had a manifest. Every manifest had a signature, and every signature belonged to a human being who had at some point held a pen. Explosives are the most heavily documented objects on the planet, and the only reason they ever kill anyone is that somewhere in the chain, a person decided that one line of the ledger did not need to be true. So Dade did not think of himself as a brave man. He thought of himself as an auditor who worked outdoors. He had rules, and the rules were not his. They were the trades, worn smooth by a century of men and women learning them the expensive way. 2-man rule. Nothing moves alone. Nothing is opened alone. Nothing is signed alone. Count it in, count it out, then count it again with a different person. Never carry a live initiator and a live charge in the same vehicle. Never assume the shunt is on. Never assume the paperwork is right just because it is neat. That last one was the one he repeated most often to new hires, and the one they understood the least, because they were young, and they thought neat handwriting was the same thing as honesty. He came home for good the year he turned 43, tired in a way sleep did not touch, and frightened by the discovery that he could no longer remember the names of every person on his teams. He landed in Cutwell, Indiana, a town of 4,000-odd people in Colbert County, where the whole economy had sat on top of the finest building limestone in North America for 130 years. He had a cousin there. That was the entire reason. He needed a place with a bed in it, and Cutwell had one. What Cutwell also had was Corabelle Odom, who ran the front counter at the feed and hardware on Fenimore Street, and who had, on his 4th visit, looked at the length of chain he was buying, and said, "That's the wrong gauge for what you're doing, and you don't want to hear that, but you do want to hear it." She was 41, divorced once and unbothered by it, and she laughed at things sideways. They were married 11 months later in the little brick church on Chandler Hill, and Dade, who had spent 2 decades treating every human interaction as a briefing, discovered that he had no idea how to be happy and would have to learn it the way he had learned everything else. Slowly, 1 centimeter at a time. Meadow arrived a year after that. He was 45 when he first held her, and the first thing he did, standing in a hospital corridor at 4 in the morning with a 7-pound person against his chest, was start counting. Fingers, toes, breaths per minute. He caught himself doing it and laughed out loud, alone. He built the business because it was the only thing his experience translated into that did not require him to leave. Steadman Seismic, 2 trucks, a shed behind the house, 31 portable seismographs, and a state license to perform blast vibration monitoring and pre-blast structural surveys. Here is what that means, if you have never lived near a working quarry. When a quarry sets off a shot, the ground carries the energy outward as a wave, and that wave rattles the houses of everyone within a mile or 2. State law caps how hard those houses are allowed to be rattled. So somebody has to sit a calibrated instrument on the porch of every house near the blast, record the peak particle velocity, print a compliance report, and file it. That somebody, in Colbert County, was Dade Steadman. He had 31 instruments out at any given time, on porches and foundation slabs and basement floors from the river bottoms up to Chandler Hill, and they did not care what time it was or whose house they were sitting on. They recorded continuously, at 2,000 samples per second, and they uploaded everything to a server in his shed at 11 o'clock every night. 4 years of that. A quiet, unremarkable, deeply documented 4 years. He did not know it yet, but he had spent those 4 years building the single most complete forensic record in the state of Indiana, and he had built it entirely by accident, for the most boring reason imaginable, because somebody had to. The ground keeps its own ledger. He just happened to be the man holding the pen. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in the 2nd week of October, and the only reason Dade was in the kitchen at all was that Corabelle had left the house at 5:40 to deal with a bus that had thrown a belt out on County Road 9. That was her job. She was the transportation coordinator for the Colbert County School District, which meant she owned every route, every driver, every substitute, and every parent complaint in a 200-square-mile area, and it meant that when a bus broke down in the dark, she went out to it with a thermos and a clipboard because she did not believe in sending people places she would not go herself. She had kissed the back of Dade's neck on her way past the bed and said, "Lunch is on you," and he had grunted something and gone back to sleep for 40 minutes. So at 6:50 in the morning, he was standing at the counter in a t-shirt and yesterday's jeans, and Meadow was at the table in her socks, eating cereal and narrating a dream about a horse that could fold itself, and the coffee was doing its work, and it was, by every measure available to him, a good morning. Meadow was 8. She had Corabelle's sideways laugh and Dade's habit of going very still when she was thinking, and she had recently developed a serious interest in the concept of fairness, which she applied with prosecutorial rigor to bedtimes, dessert portions, and the seating arrangements in her 2nd-grade classroom. Her backpack was on the 3rd chair. It was purple, with a patch of a fox on the front flap that Corabelle had sewn on crooked, and that Meadow had declared was better crooked. Dade picked it up to get the lunch container out of the main compartment. He was not paying attention. He was listening to the horse dream. He unzipped the front pocket instead of the main one, out of habit, because that is where the container had been the week before, and his hand went in flat, the way a hand does when it is not looking, and his hand stopped. Not his brain. His brain was still in the horse dream, still forming a follow-up question about whether the horse folded lengthwise or in quarters. His brain had nothing to do with it. His hand simply refused to close, the way a hand refuses when it finds a wasp. He stood absolutely still with his fingers inside his daughter's school bag, and he began, without any conscious decision, to do the thing he had done 10,000 times on his stomach in the mud. He read the object with his fingertips. A cylinder, metal, small, about the diameter of a pencil, maybe 6 centimeters of it. Cool. A crimp near one end. A hard ring where a machine had squeezed a shell closed around something, and two wires coming off it, insulated, thin, coiled neatly and tucked back along the body. Two leg wires, copper, not twisted together at the ends, not shunted. He was aware, distantly, of Meadow saying, "Dad, Dad," in quarters. It folds in quarters. He counted 3 of them by touch before he let himself think a single word. 3 cylinders, foam between them, sitting inside a soft blue pencil case in the front pocket of a purple backpack with a crooked fox on it. Instantaneous electric detonators, number 8 strength, commercial, the kind that lives in a magazine with a 2-man rule and a daily count and a federal license, and that never, under any circumstance in any lawful universe, ends up loose in a fabric bag being carried by a child onto a school bus. Unshunted, which meant the safety practice of twisting the 2 lead wires together, so a stray current from a radio, a phone, a static charge, a passing power line cannot complete the circuit, had not been done. Somebody had either not known to do it, or had undone it, or had never been taught. Dade Steadman had, in his life, held some version of this feeling perhaps 6 times, once in Bosnia, once in Angola, twice in Iraq. It is not fear. Fear is loud. This was the opposite of loud. It was a kind of vast, cold clarity, like a room going bright. He did not jerk his hand out. He did not gasp. He did not say a word. He very slowly, over the course of maybe 9 seconds, withdrew his hand, palm flat, fingers straight, touching nothing on the way out. He set the backpack down on the chair with 2 hands and did not let it tip. Then he turned around and looked at his daughter, who was watching him now with cereal halfway to her mouth, because kids read their parents the way sailors read weather. "Meadow," he said, and his voice came out exactly the way it always did, which cost him more than anything he had done in 22 years. "Would you go get your shoes on for me, the blue ones, and take your bowl to the sink first, because your mother will kill us both." She went. She took the bowl. She was gone up the stairs. Dade counted her footsteps to the landing, and then he moved. He did not call 911. Later, people would ask him about that, and he would tell them the truth. A 911 call brings a deputy, and a deputy in Colbert County is a 24-year-old with 11 months on the job who has never seen a detonator outside a training slide, and that deputy will do the natural human thing, which is pick it up and look at it. Dade had spent 22 years learning that the most dangerous object in any incident is an untrained person with good intentions. Instead, he went out to the shed. He came back with a 50 caliber ammunition can, an empty one, and a bag of the fine washed sand he used for calibration seeding. He poured 4 inches of sand into the can. Then he came back to the kitchen, opened the front pocket of the backpack all the way so nothing would snag, lifted out the blue pencil case with both hands and no tilt, and set it into the sand. He laid another 2 inches of sand over it. He closed the can, latched it, and carried it out to the bed of his truck, where he set it in the far corner behind the wheel well, as far from the cab and from any antenna as the vehicle allowed. Total elapsed time from the moment his hand stopped, 4 minutes, 10 seconds. He knew, because he had looked at the microwave clock when it happened. He always looked at the clock. It was a reflex from the job. You want the time on everything. Then he went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and waited for his daughter to come down the stairs in her blue shoes. She came down. She stood in the doorway and looked at him and said, "Are you mad?" "No," he said. And then, because he had spent 22 years learning that the fastest way to lose information is to frighten the person who has it, he made himself smile and he said, "Meadow, I found the little metal things in your front pocket. I'm not mad. I just want to know about them, because I collect boring facts, and this is a really good boring fact." She relaxed. That was the thing that stayed with him afterward, for months. She relaxed, because she had been carrying something and she was glad, at 8 years old, to finally be allowed to put it down. "Uncle Brix puts that in there," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. "Okay," Dade said. "He says it's a school project." She looked at her shoes. "He says I can't tell you, or he'll do Perry instead." Dade Steadman had, in his career, been present for 2 catastrophic detonations, 1 aircraft crash, and an ambush on a road outside Kirkuk that took 4 people he had eaten breakfast with. He had never, at any point in any of it, felt what he felt in the next 4 seconds, standing in his own kitchen in his socks. Perry was Perrine Odom, 6 years old, Brix's own daughter, Meadows' cousin, who had a gap in her front teeth, and who was, as of last month, extremely committed to the idea of becoming a veterinarian for large animals only. "He'll do Perry instead," Dade repeated, carefully, keeping every ounce of what was happening behind his face where it belonged. "He said if I tell, then Perry has to do the project." Meadows' chin went, and Perry's little. Dade got down on one knee, which he had learned somewhere along the way was the correct altitude for hard conversations with 8-year-olds, and he put both hands on his daughter's arms and said, "Meadow, look at me. Listen, you did nothing wrong. Not one thing. And you are never going to carry that project again, and neither is Perry, and I am going to take care of the whole thing, and it is going to be completely boring." "Okay," she said. "Do you believe me?" "Yeah," she said, and she did, entirely, immediately, because she was 8 and he was her father, and that particular unearned faith was, at that moment, the heaviest thing he had ever been handed. He drove her to school. He walked her to the door. He watched her go inside. Then he sat in his truck in the loop outside Colbert Elementary with a can of sand in the bed and his hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, and he did not move for 11 minutes. He was not paralyzed. He was working. Because here is the thing that separated Dade Steadman from almost anyone else this could have happened to. Almost anyone else would have driven straight to Brix Odom's house and taken the door off the hinges. Dade understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has spent his life around things that punish haste, that if he did that, he would get exactly one outcome: a fistfight, a charge against himself, a wife's brother in a hospital bed with a lawyer, and, critically, no chain of custody, no lot numbers, no record, and no answer to the only question that actually mattered. Because 3 detonators in a backpack is not a plan. 3 detonators is a delivery. Somebody at the other end was receiving them, and somebody at the far other end was using them for something. And that meant that the question was not, what do I do to Brix? The question was, how many, and where did they go, and what did they do when they got there? He was an auditor who worked outdoors. So he opened the notebook he kept in the door pocket, clicked his pen, and wrote, in the small square handwriting of a man who has filled 1,100 pages of task book, Tuesday, 0651, front pocket, purple pack. 3. Instantaneous electric debts. Number 8, unshunted, foam separated, blue pencil case. Recovered 0655. Secured in sand, vehicle bed. Subject states, recurring. Subject states, Uncle Brix. Subject states, threat P.O., age 6. Do not confront, do not call county. Find the count. Then he underlined the last 3 words twice, put the truck in gear, and drove home to start. Brix Odom was 38 years old and had been, for most of his life, the kind of man everybody liked and nobody would loan money to. He was Corabelle's younger brother by 4 years, and he had the Odom face, heavy brows, easy grin, a laugh you could hear across a parking lot. He had Perrine every other week, and he loved her with the loud, showy, unreliable love of a man who is very good at the fun parts. 9 years earlier, he had started an excavation company with a business card that said Odom Site Services and a silhouette of a bucket on it. For about 3 years it worked. Then a pipeline contract fell through, and the county fined him over a culvert he had not permitted, and then he did the thing that men like Brix do, which is not to shrink the problem, but to bet on making it disappear. By the time Dade found the pencil case, Brix Odom owed a little over $80,000 to an outfit that ran a sports book out of the back of a body shop in Terre Haute, and he had been paying interest on it for 2 years, the way a man bails a boat with a coffee cup. He had a job at the quarry, Cutwell Stone and Aggregate, the big pit on the north side of the river, 1,100 acres of hole in the ground, and 140 employees. Brix was a blaster's helper, the man who loads holes, runs downline, ties in the shot, and hauls the powder truck. It was decent money, and it required a federal license, which he had, because Dunham Weatherly, the blaster in charge, had vouched for him 6 years earlier when Bricks was still a man worth vouching for. Dade knew all of this. He had known it for years, the way you know the shape of a relative. What he had never once done was look at it. He started looking on Tuesday afternoon. The first thing he did was the hardest, and it took him 3 days to do it right, because he refused to do it wrong. He needed to know how many times. Any competent adult can get a wrong answer out of a child in about 90 seconds. You ask a leading question, the child wants to please you, and the number they give you is the number they think you want. Dade had spent years being taught, in the deeply unromantic language of incident investigation, how not to do that. You do not ask how many times. You do not ask, did Uncle Bricks do this a lot? You anchor to events the child already remembers for their own reasons. So on Tuesday evening, he sat on the floor of Meadows' room, building a paper chain for a Halloween thing at school, and asked which days Uncle Bricks picked her up. Tuesdays and Thursdays, because Mom has the late meeting. On Wednesday, washing the truck, he asked whether the project had happened on the day of the assembly with the bird show. Yes, she remembered, because the bird made a mess on the gym floor. On Thursday, he asked whether it had happened before or after her friend Ansley moved away. Before. And before the fair? Yes. And in the summer? No, not in the summer. It started after the pumpkin thing at the church. By Friday night, working entirely off her own landmarks, the bird show, the fair, Ansley, the church pumpkin sale, a substitute teacher, a broken swing. He had a list of 14 distinct days between the second week of school and that Tuesday. 14. He sat in the shed with the list on the workbench in front of him, and he did the multiplication out loud, alone, because saying it was somehow necessary. 3, he said, times 14, 42. 42 instantaneous electric detonators, unshunted, in a fabric bag, in a house, in a car, on a school bus, in a coat closet at Colbert Elementary between the hours of 8 and 3. 42 times a lightning storm did not roll over Colbert County, while a purple backpack sat on a hook. Dade Steadman put his hands flat on the workbench and breathed for a while. Then he wrote the number at the top of a fresh page, and under it he wrote the only question that mattered. 42 of what, from where, to whom, for what. That night at dinner, Corabelle asked him if he was all right, because he had been out in the shed until 9, 3 nights running, and Dade Steadman looked his wife in the face and said, "Just the fall compliance filings. It's a slog." It was the first time he had lied to her in 11 years of marriage. He felt it go into him like a splinter, and he did not take it out, because he had already run the problem, and the answer came back the same every time. Corabelle loved her brother. Not blindly. She had bailed him out twice and stopped, and she said hard things to his face at Thanksgiving. But she loved him. And their mother, Adeline, loved him without any qualification whatsoever, because Bricks was the baby and the boy, and had been getting the last biscuit since 1988. If Dade told Corabelle on Friday, Corabelle would call Adeline by Saturday, and Adeline would call Bricks by Saturday afternoon, and Bricks would empty his truck, wipe his phone, and vanish into a story about how he had no idea what was in that pencil case, and the 42 would become a thing nobody could prove, and everybody would spend the next 30 years arguing about at family funerals. So he lied. And he wrote the date of the lie in the notebook too, under the entry, because if he was going to do a thing like that, he was going to at least have the decency to keep a record of it. The next Monday, Dade Steadman did what he had done 140 times before, which was drive up to the gate at Cutwell Stone and aggregate, with a truck full of seismographs and a clipboard. Nobody looked at him twice. He had been servicing the compliance monitoring on that quarry for 4 years. He knew the scale house woman's grandchildren's names. He knew where the good coffee was, and where the bad coffee was, and which of the two he was allowed to drink. He was, in the language of his old trade, already inside the wire. He found Dunham Weatherly in the shot shack, a plywood room bolted to the side of the magazine yard, where the blaster in charge did his paperwork under a fluorescent tube that had been buzzing since the second Bush administration. Weatherly was 61, built like a filing cabinet, and had been setting off explosives for a living since he was 20. He wore reading glasses on a bootlace, and he had a way of licking his thumb before turning a page that Dade found unaccountably comforting. "Steadman," he said, "you here to tell me I shook somebody's china again?" "You're inside on everything," Dade said. "I'm here to swap batteries and be nosy." That was the whole approach. Dade did not go in with a theory. He went in with the only tool that has ever reliably worked on a paper trail, which is a genuinely curious man asking boring questions in an order that seems random. He asked about the magazine. Weatherly was proud of the magazine because it was his. He walked Dade out and showed him the yard, the steel container painted white to keep the temperature down, the sign, the berm, the chain link with the barbed top. "Two-man rule?" Dade asked. "Two-man rule," Weatherly said, and there was a small pleasure in his voice, the pleasure of a man whose rules are respected. "Nobody opens that alone. Nobody. I don't care if it's me." "Daily count?" "Every day it's opened, signed by both. Anything don't balance, I call it in same shift, and I have done it exactly twice in 19 years, and both times it was a miscount by a kid who couldn't add." Dade nodded and asked to see the book, because he was the compliance guy, and the compliance guy asks to see books. Weatherly handed it over without hesitation, which told Dade something immediately. Whatever was wrong here, Dunham Weatherly did not know about it. The magazine log was beautiful. It was one of the most well-kept documents Dade had ever seen outside of a military armory. Every line was legible, every count balanced, every signature was there in two hands. He read it for 11 minutes and found nothing, and then he found everything, and the way he found it was the reason he had been good at his job. He was not reading the magazine log. He was reading the requisition sheets clipped behind it, the forms that said how many caps came out of the magazine on the morning of a shot and went down to the bench. And the number on those forms was always a little high. A shot pattern at Cutwell ran between 80 and 160 holes. Every hole gets a cap. You draw what you need, you load, and you bring back what you did not use, and the returns get counted back in. Except that on the sheets, the returns were being written off, not as returns, as misfires and damaged units. 2 here, 3 there, 4 on a wet day. "Dunham," Dade said, in the flattest voice he owned, "what's your damage rate on caps?" "Couple percent." "It happens. Wire gets nicked, you cut it out of the pattern and you scrap it. Says here you scrapped 161 in 14 months. Weatherly's thumb stopped halfway to his tongue. He took the sheets back. He put on the reading glasses. He went through them the way a man goes through a bank statement when his wife has just asked him a question, and Dade watched 20 years come off the man's posture in about 90 seconds. "I sign the magazine book," Weatherly said, slowly. "I don't sign the bench returns. The helper signs the bench returns to the yard clerk, and the yard clerk enters the write-off." "Who's your helper?" "Odom," Weatherly said, and then, after a pause, with a terrible dawning, "and the clerk is Nadja." Nadja Volker was 19 and had been the yard clerk at Cutwell Stone for 14 months. She had a nose ring she took out at the gate every morning and put back in every evening, and she was, according to everyone who worked there, the most organized human being on the property. She was also the reason the paperwork was clean, because when you are 19 and terrified, you do not get sloppy, you get meticulous. Dade did not go at her the way he could have. He thought about it. He was not a saint. He did not do it, and the reason was not kindness. It was tradecraft. Frightened people lie in the direction of whoever frightened them most recently, and he intended to be the last person she was ever afraid of, not the first. So he did nothing about Nadja Volker for 6 days. He went home and he opened his own archive instead. This is the part of the story where the boring man's boring business stops being boring. Dade Steadman had 31 seismographs deployed across Colbert County and a server in his shed that had been eating their output for 4 years. 2,000 samples per second, 3 axes plus air overpressure, continuously, on every one of them. He had never once looked at any of it except in a 4-second window around a scheduled quarry shot, because that was all anybody paid him to look at. The rest of it, every night, every storm, every truck going by, every door slamming, the entire seismic autobiography of a small Indiana county, just sat there on a hard drive because deleting it was more work than keeping it. At 8 o'clock on a Sunday night, he sat down in the shed with a cold cup of coffee and wrote a filter. He was looking for a signature, and he knew exactly what signature to look for, because he had spent 22 years learning to tell one kind of bang from another by the shape of it. When a house fills with natural gas and something lights it, that is a deflagration. It is subsonic. The pressure builds over tens of milliseconds. A slow shove. On a seismic trace, it looks like a soft hill. A long, low-frequency rise. Most of the energy in the air overpressure channel, and the ground barely notices. When a high explosive detonates, that is a detonation. It is supersonic. On a trace, it looks like a cliff. A near instantaneous vertical rise, energy screaming up into the high-frequency bands the ground carries beautifully and the air does not. And when a detonator initiates a booster, which then initiates a main charge, there is a signature detail that no gas leak in the history of the world has ever produced. A small, sharp, isolated spike, and then a gap of 6 to 10 milliseconds, and then the main event. The cap fires, the booster catches, the charge goes. 6 to 10 milliseconds. In a courtroom, it sounds like nothing. On a seismograph running at 2,000 samples per second, it is 12 to 20 separate data points of pure, unarguable, physical fact. Dade wrote the filter to find sharp onset events in the wrong frequency band for gas, with a precursor spike in the 4 years of archive. He ran it at 11:40 at night and went to make more coffee, because he expected it to take an hour. It took 90 seconds. 3 hits. He stood in the doorway of his own shed holding a coffee pot and looked at 3 rows on a screen, and he read the timestamps, and he knew every single one of them, because everybody in Colbert County knew all 3. January the 11th, 2:40 in the morning, the Fairlane Court duplex. Ruled a gas explosion caused by a failed flexible connector behind a stove. Nobody home. Total loss. March the 29th, 3:15 in the morning, the Shanks house on Old Kiln Road. Ruled a gas explosion caused by a corroded service line. Alberta Shanks, 79, died of smoke inhalation in her own bedroom. The county had a fundraiser. Dade had donated $80 and a casserole. August the 2nd, 4:10 in the morning, the Ackerman feed store at the corner of Fenimore and 2nd. Ruled an electrical fire that reached a propane cylinder. No fatalities. Building condemned. 3 accidents. 3 official causes. 3 tidy files. And on his screen, in 3 separate traces, recorded by 3 separate instruments, sitting on 3 separate porches for entirely unrelated reasons, the same fingerprint, a sharp precursor spike, a gap of 8 milliseconds, and a detonation. Not a gas explosion in the county. Not one. Dade Steadman set the coffee pot down on the workbench without pouring any, and sat down, and put his face in his hands, and thought about a 79-year-old woman who used to give out full-size candy bars at Halloween because she said the little ones were an insult. Then he lifted his head, and he did the arithmetic he had been avoiding for 11 days. 3 events, somewhere between 4 and 8 caps used per job, if whoever was doing this was competent and redundant, which the traces said he was. 42 delivered, maybe 20 used, which meant there were, at that moment, somewhere in Colbert County, roughly 20 commercial detonators sitting in a box belonging to a man who had already used them to kill somebody. And it meant there was going to be a 4th. Finding out who wanted 3 buildings gone took Dade Steadman one afternoon at the Colbert County Recorder's office and $4 in copy fees. That is the part people find hard to believe, and it is the truest part of the whole story. He did not hack anything. He did not follow anybody. He walked into a public office on a Wednesday, filled out a request slip, and read deeds. The Fairlane Court duplex had belonged to a woman in Florida who inherited it from her father. 9 weeks after the fire, she sold the lot to Stoker Land Group for $31,000. The Shanks house on Old Kiln Road had been in the family since 1948, and Alberta had turned down 2 written offers. Dade knew because her nephew had complained about it loudly at the fundraiser. 6 weeks after she died, her estate sold the parcel to Stoker Land Group for $22,000. The Ackerman feed store had belonged to 2 brothers who had been arguing about selling it for a decade. After it was condemned, they stopped arguing. Stoker Land Group, $44,000. Dade sat in a plastic chair under a window at the recorder's office and pulled the plat map, and there it was, The way these things always are once you finally look. A shape. Stoker Land Group had, over 3.5 years, quietly assembled 41 contiguous parcels along the south bank of the river between the old lime kiln and the Fenimore Street Bridge, roughly 110 acres. There was a preliminary planned unit development application on file with the county, 320 residential units, a marina, a commercial strip, Cutwell Commons. And the assembly had 6 holes in it. 6 parcels, scattered through the middle, belonging to people who had said no. 3 of those 6 holes had, in the last 10 months, closed. By fire. The remaining 3 were a rental house on 2nd Street, the old Presbyterian manse, and a 2-bedroom on Fairlane Court, with a wheelchair ramp and a bird feeder in the yard, belonging to Odeline Odom. Dade looked at that last line for a long time. Brix Odom's mother. Corabelle's mother. Meadow's grandmother, who had taught her to make noodles from scratch, who had a drawer full of butterscotch candies, who at 68 had told a man in a nice jacket to get off her porch twice. Dade folded the plat map into quarters, put it in his jacket, walked out to his truck, and sat with his hands on the wheel for the 2nd time in a month. Kingsley Stoker was 58 and lived in Indianapolis. He had a glass office on the 11th floor and a foundation with his name on it that gave scholarships to the children of tradesmen, which Dade found, on reflection, the single most infuriating detail of the entire affair. He had spent 30 years doing land assembly. You buy 40 parcels one at a time without letting anybody figure out you are buying 40 parcels. Because the moment they know, the price triples. The problem with assembly is the holdout. One person who will not sell can strand $10 million of capital indefinitely, and there is nothing legal you can do about it except wait or pay. Stoker had been waiting on Cutwell for 3.5 years, and he had an option agreement with an equity partner out of Chicago that expired hard in 14 months. Dade knew that because the option was referenced in a memorandum his own lawyer had recorded against the parcels, which is the kind of thing careful lawyers do and careless clients never read. 14 months, 6 holdouts, and a man who had run out of patience, which is where Creed Gable came in. Dade found him the way you find anybody in a county of 19,000 people. He asked a woman at the scale house whether Stoker Land Group ever brought their own contractors around, and she said only the one, that quiet fellow with the white truck who came to look at the buildings before they tore them down. Creed Gable was 44, from Oklahoma originally, and had spent 11 years as a wireline perforating operator in oil and gas, the man who lowers a shaped charge gun 3,000 meters down a well casing and fires it, on purpose, for a living. He had lost that license after a positive test and a lawsuit. He now did site assessment for 2 development companies, one of which was Stoker Land Group. He was, in other words, a man who was very comfortable around initiators, very good at making things fail in specific places, and completely unqualified to be within 100 miles of a residential structure. Dade did not go near him. He wrote his name in the notebook and drew a box around it and left him alone, because you do not walk up to the man who has 20 caps in his truck. Instead, on the 2nd Thursday in November, he drove 90 minutes to Terre Haute and had lunch with a man he had not seen in 9 years. Anton Fielder had been a section leader on Dade's team in Bosnia, a stubborn, cheerful Minnesotan who had gotten out in his 30s, come home, gone to fire school, and worked his way up to Deputy State Fire Marshal for the Western District. He had a bad knee and a good laugh, and he had named his second son after a village they had both cleared. They talked about nothing for 20 minutes, the way men who have shared a minefield do. Then Dade slid a folder across the table. Fielder opened it. He read for 4 minutes without saying anything. He got to the 3rd seismic trace and he stopped chewing. "That's a precursor," he said. 8 milliseconds. "On all 3? 8, 8, and 7. Fielder set the sandwich down. "Dade, my office investigated 2 of these. I have got 2 men who signed those reports." "I know. They're good men." "I know that too," Dade said. "They stood in a burned-out kitchen and looked for a burned-out kitchen and found one. Nobody in the history of the State Fire Marshal's office has ever asked a blast vibration contractor for his archive, because why would they? That's not a failure, Anton. That's a gap. Gaps aren't anybody's fault until somebody knows about them." Fielder was quiet for a while. Then he said, Alberta Shanks. Yeah, that's a homicide. That's a homicide, Dade agreed. And in about 6 weeks it's going to be 2, unless we're fast, because the last 3 holdouts are still holding out, and one of them is my wife's mother. Fielder went pale in a way that Dade recognized from a road outside Tuzla. Okay, he said, okay, this isn't mine. Explosives is ATF. I know somebody. I know exactly somebody. Special Agent Rosalba Crockett had 11 years in and a specialization in explosives trafficking, and she drove down from Indianapolis on a Saturday because Anton Fielder had used the word children on the phone. She was small and unhurried, and she asked to see the ammunition can before she asked to see anything else. They opened it in Dade's yard, on a tarp, with the 2 of them and nobody else, and the truck moved 100 feet away. She lifted the pencil case out with the care of a person who had done it many times. "Number 8, she said. Commercial. Unshunted." She looked up at him. "You didn't shunt them." "No, ma'am." "Why not?" "Because you'd want to see them how they came," Dade said. "And because putting my fingers on those wires to twist them was the exact thing I was least willing to do that morning." Crockett almost smiled. Then she read the lot number off the base of one shell with a loop and wrote it down and said, "Mr. Steadman, I want you to understand that this number tells me the factory, the production run, the distributor, and the licensee it was sold to. This is not a mystery. This is a receipt. Here is what the next 9 days looked like, and it is not what people expect, because people expect a raid. There was no raid. A raid gets you a man in handcuffs, 20 caps in an evidence bag, a good local headline, and a 5-year sentence for unlawful storage. It does not get you Alberta Shanks. It does not get you the man in the glass office on the 11th floor, who had never touched a detonator in his life and who would say, honestly and convincingly, and probably with tears, that he had hired a site assessment consultant and had no idea. Crockett wanted the whole ladder. So did Dade, and for that they needed 3 things they did not have: the source inside the quarry, proof of the payment chain, and Stoker's own voice on a recording, agreeing to a 4th. They started with the source, and that meant Nadja Volker. Dade asked to be the one who talked to her. Crockett said, absolutely not. Dade said, she's 19. She's the only person in this county who has been more frightened than me for the last 14 months. And if a federal agent knocks on her door, she will lock up so hard, you will need a lawyer and a month. I have known her since she was 15. She sold me kettle corn at the fair. Crockett thought about it and said, you will be wired. You will say nothing that could be construed as a promise, and I will be in a car at the end of the street. He met her in the parking lot of the Dollar General at 7 in the evening. He did not sit in her car, and he did not block her door. He stood 6 feet away with his hands where she could see them, and he said, Nadja, my name's Dade Steadman. You know me. 3 weeks ago I found 3 number 8 caps in my 8-year-old's backpack, put there by Brix Odom. I know about the write-offs. I'm not police and I'm not here to hurt you. I have exactly one question and then I'll go. How did he get you to sign them? She did not cry, which he had expected. She stood very straight, and she said, in a completely flat voice, he said if I didn't, he'd tell them I was stealing, and it's my signature on everything anyway. 14 months of a 19-year-old holding that in her chest, alone, every single working day. Dade said, okay. That's it? That's it. That's the whole question. And then, because it was true, and because she deserved to have somebody say it out loud, Nadja, that's the oldest trick there is. You make somebody sign one thing, and then their own signature does the rest of the work for you. It's not clever, it's just cruel, and it's been done to smarter people than both of us. She looked at him for a long moment and said, Is Meadow okay? That was the moment he knew she would help them. The hardest conversation of the entire month was not with Nadja Volker, or Dunham Weatherly, or a federal agent, or an assistant United States attorney. It was in his own kitchen on a Thursday night, and it lasted 4 hours. He told Corabelle everything. He started with the pencil case, and he went straight through, in order, without editorializing, the way you brief a serious incident. He put the plat map on the table. He put the 3 traces on the table. He told her about the lie about the compliance filings, and when he did that he stopped and apologized for it specifically, because he had made himself promise he would. Corabelle Steadman did not scream. She sat very still with both hands around a cup of tea that went cold, and she looked at the trace from March the 29th for a long time. Then she said, "Alberta Shanks used to keep my mother's tomatoes when she went to Michigan. I know. You've known about Meadow for 23 days. Yes." She stood up and walked to the sink and stood with her back to him for maybe 2 minutes, and Dade did not follow her, because he had learned somewhere in Angola that the worst thing you can do to a person absorbing a shock is stand too close to them. When she turned around, her face was wrecked and her voice was completely steady, and she said, "What do you need me to do?" "I need you not to call your mother." He would have let them do it to her house. Not a question. He agreed to it, Dade said. That's what the last 3 weeks say. He agreed to it on the condition that they wait until bingo night. Corabelle Odom Steadman put a hand flat on the counter. "Bingo's Wednesday," she said. And then, in the voice of a woman who had spent 9 years scheduling every bus in Colbert County, "Then we've got a week. Tell me what a school district transportation coordinator can do for a federal investigation, because I'll tell you what, I know where every vehicle in this county is at every minute of the day, and I have never once had a reason to use that for anything interesting." The plan they built over the next 6 days had exactly one non-negotiable condition, and Dade Steadman put it on the table in the first 10 minutes. Meadow does not carry anything. Not real, not fake, not once, not ever again. She is done. If the operation needs a child, there is no operation. Nobody argued with him. Rosalba Crockett wrote it into the plan in her own handwriting. So they built it without her, and the way they built it was, Dade would say later, the most satisfying piece of engineering he ever did. Brix Odom's next delivery run was scheduled for the following Tuesday, because Tuesday was a shot day and Tuesday was a pickup day, and he had been doing it the same way for 14 weeks, which is the mistake every amateur makes. Professionals vary. Amateurs settle into a rhythm and call it discipline. Except this time there would be no purple backpack, because Corabelle Steadman, with a clipboard, a district calendar, and the moral authority of a woman who has been running a bus fleet for 9 years, had scheduled a second-grade field trip to the state park for that Tuesday, with a note home to parents saying no pickups, buses only, both ways. Brix would arrive at the school at 3 and find no niece, and he would do what a man $80,000 in debt does when a delivery is due. He would carry them himself. That was the entire trick. They did not need to catch him planting them in a child's bag. They needed him in a truck, on a public road, with federal contraband on his person, and no 8-year-old anywhere near it. The caps he would be carrying came out of the magazine on Tuesday morning as always, drawn on a requisition and written off as damaged by a 19-year-old yard clerk who had, that week, been signing under the direct supervision of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and who had been recording every conversation she had with Brix Odom since the previous Friday on a device the size of a car key. The caps were real. They had to be, or Brix would notice. The ones that mattered were the ones Creed Gable would receive at the handoff. The handoff happened, every time, in the gravel turnout at the end of Old Kiln Road, where the county had stopped maintaining the pavement in 1994. Brix would park. Gable's white truck would pull in beside him. 90 seconds. Then 2 trucks going opposite directions. At that turnout, on Tuesday afternoon, there were 4 vehicles within 800 meters, 2 of them agricultural, and none of them interesting. And there were 11 people watching, and there was a seismograph. Dade had insisted on the seismograph. Crockett had asked why. Dade said, "Because if this ends up in front of a jury, I want a machine there that has no opinion." Brix handed over a soft-sided cooler. Gable handed over an envelope. The whole thing took 71 seconds and was recorded from 3 angles. And then, instead of arresting anybody, they let both trucks drive away. This is the part that took Rosalba Crockett 2 days and a call to an assistant United States attorney in Indianapolis to authorize, and it is the part that made the case. Because Creed Gable was going to a house on Fairlane Court on Wednesday night with a wheelchair ramp and a bird feeder, and there was a version of the next 36 hours where they simply stopped him, and Kingsley Stoker read about it in the paper and expressed shock and hired a very good firm. Dade wanted the fourth event to happen. He wanted it to happen so completely, so convincingly, that Creed Gable would drive straight from Fairlane Court to collect, and say out loud, to the man who paid him, on a recorded line, what he had just done and why. So on Wednesday afternoon, while Adeline Odom was being taken to bingo in Bloomington by her daughter, under the pretext of a birthday she had forgotten about, a technical team from ATF spent 5 hours inside her empty house. They did 3 things. They swapped the world Creed Gable was about to walk into. Pressure and door sensors on every entry, cameras in 4 rooms, and a residential gas line, isolated and purged at the meter that morning, by a utility crew that was not a utility crew. They pre-positioned, under federal permit, and with 2 certified pyrotechnicians on site, a theatrical charge in the basement, a flash and smoke effect of the sort used on film sets, incapable of damaging a joist, that would put a very loud noise and a great deal of white smoke out of the basement windows and up the stairwell. And at 4 that morning, in the motel lot on Route 60 where Gable had been staying, a woman with a flashlight in her teeth replaced what was in his cooler. The caps went out. Identical inert training units went in, serial marked, weighted, wired, and dead as a doorknob. Creed Gable arrived at the house on Fairlane Court at 9:40 on Wednesday night. He was inside for 31 minutes. He was patient and unhurried and extremely competent, and the footage of him working, which the jury saw twice, was the single most damning thing in the entire trial, because he hummed. He came out. He drove 4 blocks. He initiated from the cab of his white truck at 10:17. The basement of Adeline Odom's empty house produced a bang that rattled windows on 3 streets, and a column of white smoke 30 feet high, and Creed Gable sat in his truck and watched it in his mirror for 11 seconds, and then he made a phone call. The call lasted 2 minutes and 40 seconds. In it, Creed Gable told Kingsley Stoker that the last Fairlane parcel was done, and it went ugly, real ugly, better than the Shanks one, and Kingsley Stoker, who had 3 years and 11 months into a career of never once saying a single incriminating word, said, "Is anybody in it?" And Gable said, "Bingo night like you said." And Stoker said, "Then it's a tragedy and we're fine. Come up Friday, I'll have the rest." Rosalba Crockett, listening to that in a van 200 meters away, closed her eyes and said one quiet word that Dade did not repeat to his daughter. They took Gable 11 minutes later at the light on 2nd and Fenimore, without incident, because he had no weapon and no idea. They took Brix Odom at 6 the next morning at his apartment, and he cried, and asked for his mother, and was told that his mother was, at that moment, being informed by federal agents that her house had been used as a stage set to catch the men who had planned to blow it up with her in it, which she had been told at 9 that morning, and which she had responded to by asking, in a voice that carried down the hall, whether her good dishes had survived. They took Kingsley Stoker on Friday at 2 in the afternoon, in the lobby of his own building, on his way to lunch. The trial ran 11 days the following autumn. The government put on the lot numbers, which walked from a factory in Missouri to a distributor in Indiana, to a licensee named Cutwell Stone, and aggregate, to a requisition sheet signed B. Odom. It put on 14 months of write-offs and a 19-year-old yard clerk who testified for 2 hours and never once looked at the defense table. It put on Dunham Weatherly, who wept on the stand, once, when he was asked whether he had personally vouched for Brix Odom's federal license. And on the 6th day, it put on a blast vibration monitoring contractor with 31 instruments and a 4-year archive, who was qualified as an expert without objection, and who stood in front of a Colbert County jury and showed them 3 pieces of paper. First, a real gas explosion, recorded in Vigo County that spring. A soft hill, slow, most of the energy in the air. Then January the 11th, and March the 29th, and August the 2nd. Cliffs. And in front of each cliff, a small sharp spike, and then a gap. That gap is 8/1000ths of a second, Dade Steadman told the jury. It's the time it takes for the cap to wake up the booster. Gas doesn't do that. Gas can't do that. There is nothing else on this earth that makes that shape. Then he was asked about the 4th event, at the Odom house, and he explained that the theatrical charge had been recorded too, by his own instrument on a porch 2 houses down, and that its trace showed a precursor spike and a gap of 8 milliseconds, because the man in the white truck had built it exactly the way he had built the other three. The defense had one real question on cross, and it was a good one. "Mr. Steadman, you were monitoring these houses for the quarry. Isn't it convenient that your equipment happened to be there?" And Dade said, "No, sir. It's not convenient. It's boring. It's been there for 4 years because the state makes somebody put it there, and I'm the somebody, and I've never once been paid to look at anything except a 4-second window. Nobody planned for that archive to matter. The ground just kept its own ledger, and I happened to be holding the pen." Kingsley Stoker was convicted on 22 counts, including murder in the commission of arson for the death of Alberta Shanks, and sentenced to life without parole. Creed Gable took the same conviction and the same sentence. Brix Odom pled. The government offered him 22 years, and he took it. And at the sentencing hearing, Dade Steadman, who had refused to speak to him once in 11 months, who had refused every message, every letter, every relayed apology, exercised the victim's right to make a statement. He did not shout. He put a single sheet of paper on the podium and he read 14 dates out loud. That was all it was, 14 dates, in order, and after each one he said the same 7 words. 3 number 8 caps, 8 years old. He read all 14. It took 2 minutes and 9 seconds. The courtroom was so quiet that the stenographer's keys were the loudest thing in it. Brix Odom put his head down at the 4th date and did not lift it again. Dade folded the paper, said, "That's my statement, Your Honor," and sat down. The judge gave him 30. The 3 remaining holdout parcels never sold. The county, in a fit of civic feeling that surprised everyone, condemned Stoker Land Group's assembled acreage under the forfeiture judgment, and turned 110 acres of riverbank into the Alberta Shanks Riverfront Preserve, a gravel walking loop, 11 benches, and a small brass plaque that says exactly nothing about how it got there. Nadja Volker received full immunity and, 6 months later, a scholarship from an anonymous local donor to study accounting. She now audits explosive magazines for a firm in Louisville, and she is, by every account, terrifying. Dunham Weatherly retired and rewrote the yard clerk procedure for the entire company so that no single signature ever closes a loop again. He sends Dade a card at Christmas. Adeline Odom's house still stands on Fairlane Court, with the ramp and the bird feeder. She did lose 1 dish. And on a Thursday evening the following spring, in the gym at Culbert Elementary, an 8-year-old named Meadow Steadman stood next to a trifold poster board at the district science fair and explained to a small crowd of parents how the ground carries different kinds of shaking and why a slow push looks like a hill and a fast one looks like a cliff, and how you can tell them apart if you write everything down. Her father stood at the back with his arms folded and did not say a word. The title of her project, in glue and green glitter across the top of the board, was "The Ground Keeps Its Own Ledger." She got 2nd place. She has never once let it go. So here's what stays with me about Dade Steadman, and it isn't the trap, as good as the trap was. It's the 4 minutes and 10 seconds in that kitchen. Everything that came afterward, the seismographs, the recorder's office, the federal agents, the life sentences, was only possible because one man, in the worst moment of his life, did not do the natural thing. The natural thing is to grab your kid, drive to your brother-in-law's house, and put him through a wall. Nobody would have blamed him. I wouldn't have blamed him. But rage is fast, and fast is loud, and loud gives the other guy an exit. If he had gone through that door on Tuesday morning, Brix Odom does 4 years for reckless endangerment, Creed Gable moves to another county, Kingsley Stoker expresses his shock in a press release, and Alberta Shanks stays a gas leak in a filing cabinet forever. Instead, he wrote down the time. He always wrote down the time. The other thing I keep chewing on is how ordinary the weapon was. Not the detonators, the archive. 4 years of boring, legally mandated data nobody had ever asked to see, sitting on a hard drive in a shed because deleting it was more effort than keeping it. These men were not defeated by a hero. They were defeated by paperwork nobody thought mattered, kept properly by a man who kept things properly out of habit. That's the pattern. Somebody decides one line of the ledger doesn't need to be true, builds everything on top of that line, and then some quiet, deeply unimpressed person comes along and checks it. Be that person. Keep the receipts. Write down the time. And if a child ever tells you something strange in a flat little voice and then looks relieved, stop everything you are doing, because they have been carrying it a while and they were waiting for somebody to finally be safe enough to hand it to. If this one got you, hit that like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in that kitchen? I'll see you in the next one.